Hello and welcome to our Bible study on the post-exilic prophets and writings. My name is Edwin Weber. I'm one of the pastors at St. Mark's Lutheran in Spokane, whose ministry enables this video Bible study. Today, we are continuing our look at the book of Zechariah. Zechariah is a shorter prophetic book, but of the different prophetic books we're looking at, it's on the longer side. But it still does have certain divisions of interest, even within itself. Not necessarily inconsistencies, but different tone, different voices, different themes that suggests sort of a division of composition. We've already looked at the opening sections of chapter 8 that start with these 8 visions that all happen in the night, as Zechariah says. One night where Zechariah was given a series of visions, and we have those recorded. And then there's sort of a break after chapter 8 where the tone changes. The visions become a little more future-focused. So this could be for a variety of different reasons. Some people think that maybe there's a different writer here than the historical Zechariah. And this one might represent one of his followers who appended this prophetic work sometime a little bit later on. Some still think that this may have still been written by Zechariah, but it might reflect a sort of a second period of writing with and there are some changes in context. Particularly earlier in Zechariah, the prophet seems to be included in the religious and political dialogue. Zechariah is making these prophecies to Zerubbabel, the governor, and to Joshua, the high priest, sort of directly. It's intimate. It's closely connected. Again, insider language, right? Zechariah is in the club, so to speak. But later, the voice of Zechariah seems to represent a more marginal voice, somebody who's speaking from the outside about what's going on inside. It may reflect different authors, or it might reflect that Zechariah, who was once sort of maybe a little bit more closer with the leadership, might have been pushed out. That easily could have happened because of all the different transitions in leadership that occurred during this time. Or, as we'll see, Zechariah has a more disillusioned tone. Maybe he became more disillusioned with the leadership during that time and therefore speaks more from a marginalized voice. Another thing that people reflect on is that latter portions of Zechariah have less, shall we say, editorial unity with the earlier sections. Some people again suggest this might be of a different author, but I really think that it's possible that Zechariah himself hadn't finished the editing process for this. A lot of these books of prophecies were originally sort of sculpted from sermons, oracular, oral prophetic work that were then developed, carefully written and edited, and then kind of appended into a single scroll, a single book that had an overall literary unity to it. Well, part of Zechariah doesn't quite have that refinement. It could suggest that maybe Zechariah hadn't finished the work of editing and refining it all together before he died. So, again, we're not sure, and regardless of questions of authorship, what we do see from Zechariah is a message of one who is increasingly disillusioned with kind of the status quo, what is going on. And what is going on? Well, the predominant voices of the time that we've already heard are really suggesting things should be a lot simpler than they really are. Something like, let's just rebuild the temple. Everything will be all right. Let's reestablish a son of David on the throne. That's going to fix everything, But Zechariah is continuing to look forward to a coming restoration, but one that's not established by external means, like, it's going to be rebuilding the temple or sitting a son of David on an independent throne that's going to do all of this. Rather, Zechariah uses this notion of the day of the Lord. We'll talk a little bit more about this later on. It originally was used by Isaiah and was picked up by other prophetic leaders. This idea that God was going to intervene directly at some future time. We're really familiar with the perspective of the Bible up to this point, that God can act through leaders, through nations, through conquest, right? That's kind of the whole idea behind both Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, but also Cyrus and Persia. And Zechariah has got a different idea, right? God's not going to use kings and nations as tools. God's going to directly intervene. And we might question, what's that going to look like? We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. But first, I want to look at sort of the last little vision that we get from that first section of chapter, in the first chapter, 8 chapters. That first probably represents the first work of Zechariah. And really, I think it will get part of us to see this transition that I want to try to see if we can discern of Zechariah's evolving perspective on messiahship, on what the day of the Lord's going to look like, and who is this Messiah? Is he going to be the son of David? And if yes, then in what kind of model, so to speak? So let's look here in Zechariah 8. This is again part of the original prophecies of Zechariah from that early period. Interestingly enough, we can see this as a kind of rebuttal of some of the teachings that we see in Ezra and Nehemiah. Think about Ezra and Nehemiah, really focused on that. They're very insular. They're about us. They're against intermarriage with foreigners, and are about kind of drawing things in and together. And this is different. Zechariah has a vision where many people of many different nations are drawn to Jerusalem by God's glory. God says that I'm going to come and I'm going to dwell in Jerusalem, and my glory is going to be, it's just going to draw all nations in, which I think is, of course, really interesting, and of course, is a kind of rebuttal to that insular language used by Ezra and Nehemiah. Zechariah still has his visions of glory, of what a full restoration would look like. They are similar in some ways to the other visions that we see. Zechariah talks about restored agricultural produce, like Haggai does. He talks about a rebuilt temple, like Haggai and Ezra does. He talks about a city full of joyful children. In many ways, compared, however, to these other prophetic voices of these visions, Zechariah is more subdued, more realistic. These aren't grand visions of restoration. They are quite stated by comparison. Yet, nonetheless, you get this impression that he is looking forward to this future reality. I find it interesting because Zechariah uses this tool that was popular among prophets in this day, right? These grand visions of restoration. But he's subdued almost to a point where it would have been really quite noticeable. He doesn't exaggerate or use over-the-top language, but instead, those were very popular rhetorical tools by the other prophets in his day. Instead, he uses realistic and subdued language. It almost has just as strong of an impact because it's kind of a reaction against those over-the-top visions, perhaps. So, something interesting. This really does start to tip us towards a new theme presented in Zechariah, this evolution in the concept of Messiah. You may recall that Messiah in Hebrew literally just means anointed. We specifically often use that language to refer to the kings of Judah because they were anointed, specifically the house of David, the descendants of David. So messiahship in the house of David, son of David, very closely connected. But Zechariah is moving us beyond the notion that some son of David would arise, would become king, and establish some sort of independent and restored nation on earth, usually by conquest, right? Zechariah will still use what for him was in his day what we might say traditional messianic language, but he's also going to stretch this. They're familiar to us because we have been familiar with these concepts of Messiah for a long time. But in Zechariah's days, these really would have been stretching the concept of what Messiah would have been. And again, like I said, tips us closer and closer to Messiah language that's more familiar to us. So as we look at these passages, I want you to pay attention to the interplay between what might be thought of sort of this older vision of what a Messiah would be and what is emerging, maybe new, in some of Zechariah's vision. You might notice a bit of critique of the old way of thinking about these things, even as Zechariah continues to employ the same kinds of images. So pay attention. It's some interesting stuff here. So the first one I want us to look at in this sort of second part of Zechariah that for me represents the second work of Zechariah. It comes from chapter 9. It's the first real big messianic vision that we get. And it's actually quite well known to us because it is alluded to in the gospel. The gospel writers use this passage to talk about the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, on what we would call Palm Sunday. So as you read this, you might be familiar with it. It often is directly quoted. I think it's directly quoted by Matthew, for example, in his gospel, and might be by Luke and Mark as well. In this vision, Zechariah imagines the Lord's anointed, this Messiah, coming to Jerusalem in a victorious procession. He's a warrior. Again, this day of the Lord is concept of that God would come as a warrior king and intervene. So it's interesting that he's using language that suggests Messiah, son of David, but he's actually referring to the direct intervention of God, God's own self. In this passage, the Lord's anointed comes into Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives in a victorious procession, again, just like Jesus does on Palm Sunday. But again, Zechariah talks about this ruler uses victory language, uses warrior language, uses conquest language. But if you pay close attention, you'll notice that what the warrior is actually doing is the opposite. It's disarming the people. It says that the bow and the chariot are withdrawn and taken away. So the victory here is not so much a military victory, it's a disarmament. It really is the opposite of what we might expect, or really the audience might have thought about during a victory procession. So whomever Zechariah was originally preaching this to, they might have been kind of surprised to hear not a victory of arms, but instead the opposite, where arms are taken away and armies are disbanded. So here we have some strong messianic language, some strong concept of the direct intervention of God, but it is different again. It's a departure from some of the more expected things, which again mostly involve the image of a military victory. Now, the apparent disillusionment with this existing messianic model, the rift widens further as we turn to chapter 11 in Zechariah. This is an odd section. It kind of departs from the clarity of Zechariah's other prophecies in this section. I mentioned earlier that the latter portions of Zechariah have less editorial unity. This is a good example. I think if you read this passage, you might come away with some questions about what's going on here. Zechariah lacks a little bit of definition here. However, there is metaphorical language here. The principal image that's present is this notion of two different kinds of shepherds. Now, if you may recall, David, that first king of the house of David, the namesake of the royal house, was himself a shepherd before he was a warrior and a king. So shepherding language here likely invokes the leadership of the nation, specifically, or a little bit more specifically, the political and the spiritual leaders in general, but the son of David specifically, when we're talking about shepherding language. So, if we read this passage in that context, this passage from Zechariah seems to speak against corrupt leadership, whereby in the imagery that's given here is that God sort of disavows the blessing that God conveys, specifically these notions of favor and unity from the people. So it can kind of read as an explanation, this passage can, of why the exile happened in the first place. But remember also that all of the authors of this period, prophets and otherwise, are concerned about this notion, which is a two-sided coin, right? That which led to exile in the past might risk exile in the future. So whether you read this passage as about judgment that's been exacted in the past, or if you read this as a passage about warning the possible future, I think it goes both ways. Now, there's a later passage in the next chapter that actually speaks about, it actually involves the mourning of the house of David and its loss. Again, closely sort of connecting this notion of messiahship and anointed, this person who is the language here is the one who is pierced. So one who suffers. Again, kind of seems to allude back to Isaiah and some of those sections in 2nd Isaiah we looked at in our last unit. But speaks favorably about the house of David, but also acknowledges that the reality isn't all that it's been hyped up to be here. So I think this is another really good passage that sort of helps to build our picture of understanding of how Zechariah understands messiahship. Now there's even more shepherding language in chapter 13. Here, this is a passage that also might be familiar. I think we often read this during Holy Week, maybe on Maundy, Thursday, or Jesus definitely alludes to this in the Gospels on Maundy, Thursday. And here, image is given of a shepherd who is struck. Pierced, again, that pierced language from earlier. Now we have a shepherd who is struck. Again, something is happening to the shepherd here. And what happens when the shepherd is absent, right? The sheep scatter. So again, this might allude to a failure of the shepherd of Israel. Again, the king, the son of David. In this Persian context, it probably refers to the governor. And we know there is odd transitions that went on with the governor, and we're not sure what happened. Whether it was just, time frame, things were different, or what precisely. So there may have been some controversy over leadership, political leadership specifically in Israel during this time. But what's interesting here is that we see a new shepherd enter the picture. And again, it's not a new son of David. Now God is our shepherd. So again, some messianic language here, but ultimately it's God's self who intervenes directly in this case. The sheep go through their own trial and tribulation in the scattering. God is the one who is going to gather them again together, and the sheep will be united again in God. So read together, all of these different little messianic passages, again, they envision a kind of disillusionment with the contemporary notion that God's going to act through this single anointed human being of the house of David and reestablish the kingdom. Rather, Zechariah presents us with the notion that God is going to directly intervene into the affairs of the world. And that the notion of messiahship is still here. This figure is of the one who will come in the name of the Lord. But this is a different vision than has been given before. Something really important, I think, to pay attention to. Now, again, this notion of the direct intervention of God has a name. We often talk about it we talk about it in a variety of different languages. We talk about the second coming of Christ. We talk about the new heaven and the new earth. We talk about the new Jerusalem. We talk about the resurrection. But specifically, when we're talking about it in literary terms in the Bible, we use the word apocalypse. This is a kind of vision that was very popular among some, especially during this day. When we look at our Bible, we see maybe a little bit of apocalyptic tone in Isaiah. We get a little bit of it in Ezekiel. We get quite a bit of it in Daniel. Daniel has lots of visions about radical inbreaking of God. But really, it was very popular during this time. Even though we only get a few in the Hebrew scripture, it really was very popular among the Jews during this time. Even not all the writings made it into the Bible, but we do see a lot of contemporary examples, say from the Dead Sea Scrolls of contemporary Jewish apocalyptic literature. And this was also picked up by Christians. Apocalyptic literature was very popular among Christians too. Revelation is an apocalyptic work. In fact, it's sometimes also known as the Apocalypse, according to John. And there are a few other Christian apocalyptic writings that also did not make it into the canon of the Bible, and you can sometimes stumble across some of those writings. Now, apocalypse means something slightly different than what most of our modern ears probably hear. Most people today, when they say apocalypse, they mean some kind of big disaster, specifically, a kind of potentially world-ending disaster. And indeed, in a lot of apocalyptic literature, there is an element of destructive force, a divine force in this intervention. And yes, sometimes that language also tips towards world-ending, world-destructive, but not always. The primary expression of apocalyptic literature is that the world needs a radical inbreaking of God to set the world right again. Now that radical, how radical, right? Does it look like world ending, world destructive? Does it look like a full, complete expression of God's power? There's disagreement. But in large part because of the apocalypse of John, Revelation, in the New Testament, we do broadly have this sort of perspective that apocalypse is about the end of the world, but it's not always. At most, it's always it's about the end of the world as we know it, because there's always something new that comes. Now, you can kind of perhaps imagine why this genre was so popular during this time, right? When a lot of these faith writers, they really looked at the state of the world and saw that things were broken, and that they weren't going to be fixable without a radical inbreaking of God. So this is part of the tension that we experienced during this time. Ezra and Nehemiah being voices like, no, like perfection is possible, blessing is possible with the restoration of the temple or the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem or the adherence to these precepts. Now, Zechariah is a different perception. It's no, God's going to need to directly intervene for everything to be set right again. So in its most crystallized form, this apocalyptic vision in Zechariah comes in the final chapter of his book, chapter 14. So here we see a vision of Jerusalem. And there is a destructive element. It's not world-ending, but it is dramatic. Jerusalem is conquered again, and the experience is conquest once again, and all of the horrors associated with it. But before the second part of that conquest, right, the going into exile, right, before the fullness of exile is realized again, now we see God intervene. God is the one who intervenes. God goes forth and fights and wins victory. The city is restored. The vision of the restoration does indeed draw on this notion of the day of the Lord. We've already talked a little bit about this. This concept first developed in Isaiah, which envisions this radical intervention of God into the world as a divine warrior. And so we see that here. A lot of the images, perhaps not surprisingly, are picked up by Revelation. They are expanded on in Revelation, but they all sort of start here in Zechariah. We already saw that earlier with the vision of the horseman. Again, John in Revelation tweaks that image, changes it. But here in Zechariah, we see some interesting things. For example, in the New Jerusalem, there is no longer night. Only day, everlasting day in Jerusalem. Right? And John in Revelation takes that vision and expands on it. There is also a water that is flowing in Jerusalem, out from Jerusalem. It goes to the east, to the west, on each side. Like Ezekiel, some of that water flows out into the Dead Sea that a region that it's a desert, very barren. There's nothing you can grow there. So a vision of water flowing from Jerusalem, water of life, very important. And again, echoed in Revelation when John envisions the river of life flowing from the throne of God right through the city streets in the New Jerusalem. So Zechariah does eventually use some of that over-the-top restoration language that was so popular among the other prophets in the time, but he sets the goal point differently than anyone else has. Right? It's not set by an earthly timetable. It's not, oh, if only we make it back to Jerusalem. Oh, if we only rebuild the temple. Oh, if only we follow these precepts, right? Zechariah makes it clear. It will be in the fullness of God's time. And it will involve God directly intervening into the world. And so we get a vision of the eschaton here, of the end times. Perhaps. Interestingly enough, of course, Zechariah again, not the end of the world, just the end of the world as he knew it. And we can even see, the page turned again and again. Perhaps Zechariah is envisioning, in metaphorical language, the coming of Christ in his own day. Maybe Zechariah is envisioning the fullness of the coming of Christ with the second coming. So again, open to interpretation. Definitely Zechariah gives us a vision of the eschaton. So these future visions, these visions of the future, this Messiah is going to be taken one step further by our last prophet, the prophet Malachi, who we're now going to turn our attention to. We'll be talking more about Malachi next time, and I call him our last prophet because he is the last prophet in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible. And he does. I'm including him tonight. I shouldn't say tonight, with Thursday night session. Whenever you may be watching this, I'm including it in this session because Malachi and Zechariah share some similarities. Malachi, like Zechariah, is looking for this coming day of the Lord. Specifically, this notion of God's intervention to the world. But Malachi adds a concept, one that's really important, which is that a messenger is going to come before the Lord to sort of announce his coming, herald its arrival, the arrival of the Lord. So Malachi really exhibits this just in his name. The word Malachi literally means my messenger. So much like Haggai, it would seem like his name means something and means something specifically connected to his ministry, his teaching. And the reality is that we actually don't have any other personal information about Malachi. Again, lots of scholarly speculation. I want to try to present a sort of an overview of some of the scholarly perspective. Some scholars might think that Zechariah might have written Malachi. Malachi is very, very short. It's appended to Zechariah, as was common when there were shorter books that would have been grouped together. You might recall Zechariah and Malachi make up the last two books of a larger scroll called the Book of the 12 of the minor prophets. Who just take up little books, relatively short books. So again, like maybe this is Zechariah, and he wrote this, and then it was later split off into two. But I actually don't think that's very likely. Malachi has some similarities with Ezra and Nehemiah on the way of foreign marriages. And we've already looked at today passages from Zechariah that seem to suggest he was in favor of more Gentile inclusion. So it makes sense to me that these are actually two different authors. And many of the early, this is another thing that makes me think that they really are two different authors, not one. Many of the early sages who wrote the early rabbinic literature, they often held Zechariah and Malachi as the last prophets. Again, they're at the end of the Bible. So the last prophets who were engaged in this ministry. And the key word there is prophets. plural, right? They understood them. The earliest readers of these books of scripture understood them as two different prophets. Excuse me. But there are other things that are going on here, that can suggest to people why these are two different prophets, right? There seems to be a change in time frame. For example, Malachi seems to be very clearly written after temple services have been restored. He's got a very big focus on the priesthood. He's got some critiques for the priests in the temple, right? And we can probably reasonably date this between 515 and 445 BCE, based upon all of the different context clues of Malachi. And so there could have been overlap, a little bit of overlap with Zechariah, but it likely reflects that Malachi was written sometime after the end of Zechariah was written. But again, all of these, two authors, one author, they're just the best speculations and guesses of modern scholarship. The thing is, all of which at the end for me suggests that Malachi is his own prophet. But it is kind of sad that we don't have more identifying information, no additional personal information. Maybe Malachi likes that. Because what we do have is left is the contextual clues from the book itself, what Malachi wrote about. It's short, just about as short as Haggai is. It's probably why it was originally appended onto Zechariah and some of the other prophetic scrolls. One of the big focuses on Malachi is his concern with the affairs of worship in the temple. And he's got some critique for the priests there. This again suggests that there had been at least some time that had passed between the original sort of reestablishing of temple worship and to allow the time for these corruptions to sort of abuses, misuses, if you will, to creep in. So really this stands as a polemic against corrupt priests. It might reflect the perspective of an ordinary believer in Jerusalem who was unhappy with the state of the priesthood. Or it could, in fact, be a priest who was disillusioned with what was going on in the temple and so turned prophet, left the ministry in the temple and became a prophet to speak this against the priesthood and their abuses. In which case, Malachi could be a kind of a moniker. Maybe he's choosing to call himself Malachi because maybe he doesn't want to be known. Maybe he's not from a priestly family or an important family, just a common person. And so he's choosing to just use Malachi and not include any background information because it's irrelevant or it's unimportant or it's not all that grand. We don't know. It's always kind of sad to not have a lot of biographical data for the people that we are looking at. But there is some really interesting things that go on here, specifically in relationship to the priesthood. I put these passages up here. They are totally optional. They're not really that big impactful. But if you'd like to get a taste, a flavor of Malachi's critique of the priesthood, you can read these sections, and I think you'll get a good idea where he's coming from. But next time, we're going to look really specifically at Malachi's visions of this for the future and this coming messenger and the coming day of the Lord. That's where we'll turn our attention to next time. But for now, thank you so much for joining me, and peace be with you.